Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to another episode. And today I have with me John Katsos. There's various ways I can introduce John, but I've decided I'm going to introduce him as HBR published author John Katsos because he's the only guy I know who's published articles in the Harvard Business Review. But that's just a small snippet of his work. So, John, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tom, and Happy New
Year. John, as I mentioned, wrote a series of articles for a recent HBR article or series on the big idea. That led to a conversation. That led to one podcast. And this has led to this podcast because John has worked outside of the United States internationally in a variety of, probably the best word would be hotspots, over his career. And I wanted to maybe explore with him how some of the issues that he has seen in conflict zones, areas where climate change has been particularly prevalent, lead to corporate responses such as ESG. So, John, I hope I got all of that right. And if I did, could you tell us a little bit about what you're up to now?
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me on the show, Tom. It's always fun to talk. So yeah, right now I'm principally organizing a couple of different studies. One of the big ones is to take a look at how multinationals and small and medium enterprises are interacting in 5 conflict zones. So our focus right now is on Myanmar, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Northern Ireland, and Iraq. And so the hope is to see, because these 5 conflict zones are in different stages of conflict. Some of them are coming out of conflict and trying to really move towards, not just post-conflict, but really move towards more stable societies. And others are in the midst of conflict, and still others are sort of in the lead up to it and sort of in pre-conflict phases. So that's a big project I'm working on now, in addition to some of the other I'm working on a book with my colleague Jason Michaelian. And working on sort of other articles as we go forward. Usually, again, focusing on businesses in conflict zones and how they can make places better instead of making them worse.
So, John, I wanted to maybe start with an exploration of how you see sectarian or other conflicts, as well as climate change, driving migration. And as you know, I'm in Texas, southern border of the U.S. We've seen economic migration, certainly my entire lifetime in Texas. But something seems to have changed in terms of migration. And I don't recall a time since perhaps World War II when we saw a lot of displaced persons migrating, that we saw such a wide range of migration from different areas across the country, across the world, literally from Central America to the United States, from the Middle East to Europe, from Central Asia to Eastern Asia and others. So I was wondering if you might just set the stage and how do both of these problems or issues drive migration that you've seen?
Yeah, so it's a great point. I think what's changed is the scale. But what hasn't changed is that environmental factors lead to migration, and they also lead to social strife. And these sort of all work together. If you look back just civilizationally, human civilization has been all about migration. So for most of human history, we've migrated from place to place, largely in response to either social and political issues, or more normally we've migrated as humans because of environmental issues, right? So the climate changes. This is a thing that does happen. What's changed lately, so what's different about this century is again the scale, both in terms of how quick the climate is changing, but then also the scale of the number of people that it's affecting. So if you look 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, the number of people simply isn't nearly as large as it is today. And also the scale of the climate change and the rapidity of it is not the same. So to give you an example of how this plays out, a lot of people look at the Syrian civil war, a lot of scholars look at the Syrian civil war as conflict that took place in the aftermath of climate impacts. So there were a series of once-in-a-century droughts that hit Syria more or less year after year after year in the early 2000s and sort of into 2010. That led to a migration internally of Syrian farmers, people who used to be living off of the land, into larger cities. So into Damascus, into Aleppo, into understandably larger city centers, so that people could find jobs, so people could make money to feed their families, because previously they would have been out in rural areas with no problem, right? They would have had more than enough food to eat. As a result, right, that increased the pressure in those cities and increased all sorts of social pressures that were taking place. And that was a lot of the spark or a lot of the motivating factors that then pushed Syria into a civil war, where those issues that existed before were there, right? So the issues that caused the Syrian civil war were not didn't emerge out of nothing, but the pressures that were put on the Syrian government from having all those people now in the cities and really paying attention to what they were doing made what was an already difficult situation much, much worse. So again, that's how it plays out in sort of more recent times. But this is a phenomenon that's plagued humans for basically the entirety of the human race's existence on Earth.
Could we characterize the Irish potato famine and the Irish migration from the 1840s and early 1850s as climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I would say those are, whether it's climate change or just environmental catastrophes that hit particular places and then force people to migrate. Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at a lot of the migration that happens to the whether it's to the United States or to other places that aren't suffering from the same environmental issues, you see time and again that people move to where there's not only jobs, but they move to where there's food and where there's the ability of the land or the government to be able to sustain them. And I don't think that's going away. In fact, again, I think it's getting worse because of the scale. We just have a lot more people than we've ever had as the human race, right? So globally, there's just so many more people, and we're all getting the environmental impacts, or globally, there are environmental impacts that are happening at the same time. So whereas something like the Irish potato famine might have been isolated, right? So it's isolated to a particular location environmentally. What's happening with climate change is we're seeing environmental degradation and destruction globally. So it's not something that you can just isolate to one place and say, okay, well, we'll deal with this narrow group of people from this small place. Instead, we're having to deal with lots of people from lots of places. And the ability of countries to manage that is becoming more and more difficult.
John, if I could turn maybe to focus on conflicts, sectarian or other, as opposed to climate change. You've also studied those issues. What does the role of conflict, actual war, civil war, revolution, rebellion, or any other moniker we might put on it, play in the migration you've observed?
Yeah, lots. I mean, so I think those are the two main drivers of people to leave, right? Are political instability and violence on the one hand, and then environmental issues on the other hand. Sometimes those go hand in hand. And again, the Syrian civil war is a nice example of that, where they're coming together. What I think you see most in conflict zones is people move around, but don't in sort of the U.S. and in Europe, we often think about people coming to us from conflict zones. But as you rightly noted, one of the largest migrations related to the aftermath of World War II, and it was really people coming from neighboring countries to their next door, right? And something similar has happened in Syria, where 95% of Syrian refugees are in countries that border Syria. So when we talked about, a few years ago, we talked about these large waves of migration coming from, in particular, Syria. Most of those, that didn't represent the largest proportion of Syrian refugees, right? Most of them went to Turkey, they went to Lebanon, they went to Jordan, they went to places that were neighboring where they could easily be able to get back, potentially, to their homes and to where they wanted to be. When we see these sort of waves of people coming, what's remarkable is that that's still not as big of a fraction of the general sort of global refugee population. So when people are impacted by conflict zones, we often see they're not traveling far distances. And if they are, it tends to be because they a lot of times they'll have the money and the wherewithal to make those trips or to send people on those trips. So many of the folks that we're seeing in Western economies coming from Syria, or coming from um, um, places that are impacted in the Middle East by conflict zones, are the people who have the financial wherewithal to send people, because you have to pay smugglers, you have to pay people along the way to get you there. It's often substantially cheaper to just stay relatively close to home in a neighboring country.
And how does this migration caused either by climate change or conflict really lead to potential worker or personal exploitation of people?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So on the one hand, you have these people. A lot of people are coming in legal ways, obviously, but then there's many people who are being who are using more or less criminal networks to get them in or out, and those criminal networks are often then exploiting people in other ways, right? So the moment you come into contact with these organizations, you leave yourself open to the potential to be exploited. Either they just take your money and don't deliver the services, or they use you for other things or force you to do yet other things. The issue on the business side is that very often companies with large spread out supply chains are not paying nearly enough attention to how those networks can then leverage their power over people to make it appear as though someone is working voluntarily when they're really not. And this is it's a sort of a constant challenge in the supply chain. It's not that there's no way to deal with it, but it means that it's something that companies have to be focused on to try to make sure that they're not using labor that's being exploited. The second part of that is that often when people are coming in from other places, especially when they're in moments of economic desperation, they're putting wage pressure, downward wage pressure, on jobs that otherwise might have higher wages. And so what the less reputable companies are doing is sometimes they're then using that they're using that labor that's much cheaper and that is often off the books, right? They're not paying taxes on it, or they're paying limited taxes on it, to be able to undercut the prices of their competitors. Um, for the ethical businesses, this is a real challenge, right? Because you see this going on. You see that maybe your competitors are doing this, and you're put in a position where you might be undercut on prices. You just have to sort of stay the course and hope that put pressure on your government to enforce the rules, and to make sure that they're going after the people who are doing those sorts of things.
John, I'd like to now turn to the role of corporations, corporate response, and leading to ESG responses. You have researched and written about a variety of topics up to and including the corporate response. So if I could maybe start with as broad a question as I could think of, what's the role of a corporation if it's trying to do business ethically and in compliance in a conflict zone?
Yeah, I think if you're coming in, there's two types of businesses to think about, and I'm going to focus on the first type. So I think the issues for companies from outside those conflict zones are different from the ones that are already there, and maybe are local, right? So are not foreign-based companies. But I'll focus on the first group because I think that's sort of where your question is driving at. For those groups, I think the first question is, why are you there, right? Are you there because if you're just there for exploitative reasons, right? So if you're there to take something out as quickly and efficiently as possible and sell it somewhere else, you need to be really careful about where your funding is going, who you're paying, who you're employing, and how your operations are working next to or in concert with conflict actors. So there's people who are bad people in those locations, and you have to be very, very careful that your operations are not helping the bad people, and then in particular that your operations are not impacting innocent people negatively. So doing no harm is the key principle in all of these locations, right? You shouldn't be, your operations should not be funding gun runners, right? Your operations should not be funding regimes that are committing genocide or directly helping those regimes do those things. So that's I think the first key critical question. And then from there, after you figure out, okay, why are we there? You can then figure out, do we need to be there? Right. So sometimes withdrawing is worse for the people on the ground and for the conflict than staying on the ground, right? Than maintaining a presence. So sometimes companies are supplying necessary jobs, necessary goods like foodstuffs that are actually helping to make the conflict not as bad, right? So they're making it better. But each company is going to have to make that determination, right? If you're extracting oil out of the ground, you have to ask yourself, what's the likelihood that you're making things worse by making tax payments to governments that are doing bad things, or having to pay protection money, which is a fairly typical problem in conflict zones.
How does a company, or how would you counsel a company, perhaps would be the better way, to perform due diligence to assure that, number one, the people they're doing business with aren't on any of the bad guys lists? Number two, some of these extra judicial payments you've mentioned, that don't get caught in that imbroglio, and that you're paying the monies you owe as an extractor or other business to a legitimate government, or at least one recognized by Western countries?
Yeah, I think that's a great set of questions. I think the most important thing to do is to ask yourself, can you do effective due diligence? And if the answer is no, in a conflict zone, you have to assume that the worst is happening. So you're flipping the script and basically saying, look, if you cannot do adequate due diligence in a conflict zone, you've got to have a baseline assumption then that your operations are in some way doing harm. If you have that default, if your default is, if we can't do it, then it means it's happening. Or if we can't measure it, if we can't see, if we can't send inspectors, if we can't do the audits, if we don't know where payments are going, we have to assume that they're going to the wrong places. I think what you'd see is two things. So first, you'd see conflict actors, and especially governments, making sure that you could do your due diligence. And so we've seen this in a couple of locations where companies basically say, look, if we can't do due diligence, we're going to withdraw, right? Make it very clear. If we can't actually assure that the money we're spending is going where it's supposed to go, we can't be there anymore. And so that puts pressure on the people who can make it happen to allow the due diligence process to run its course. And then the second is, if it can't run its course, you have a plan for shutting down that portion of your operations that you can't do due diligence for.
John, one of the things I know you have studied from an academic perspective is due diligence, and it strikes me that there's multiple levels of due diligence on multiple actors that any company working in a conflict zone would need to perform. Obviously, the people you're doing business with, but those you may be making extrajudicial payments to, as well as to the national government to see if it's legitimate and or recognized by Western powers. How do you counsel companies to think through due diligence in conflict zones?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first point is to make sure that you can do the due diligence. And that's really the critical factor. And in a lot of these places, you simply can't. It's very hard to assure that that you can actually get the information that you need to do the due diligence. So for companies in conflict zones, that means having a very clear red line that if you can't do due diligence, you have to assume that money is going to places and people who they shouldn't be going to. And that also means then having a process for dealing with withdrawing or shutting down operations in cases where due diligence can't be done.
John, when most Americans think of modern slavery or human trafficking, they start back to the Liam Neeson Taken movies, and they think about sexual exploitation. And that is really not the problem corporations face. They face either human trafficking and modern slavery in their supply chain, or simply exploited workers who may be paid a subsistence level of income, or certainly below market rates. How do you help companies think through the issue of low paid wages or exploited workforce in connection with migration issues going forward?
Yeah, it's a great point. So there's a couple of ways that I think we walk through for companies on how to deal with this. One is to really go beyond just what contracts will say. So there's a lot of places where the contract will say one thing, but what the workers are actually getting is much less than what the contract is saying. So it's important to go beyond, at least on a spot check basis, to beyond what the paperwork is saying, to actually ask workers what they're getting paid, right? What's the situation like on the ground? And being able to verify that what's in the contract is actually what's being given to the workers. So we've seen there's lots of places where the contract will say one thing, and what the contract they're providing for due diligence might not be the same document they're providing even to the government, right? On what the government work, what the terms of the agreement actually are, or they may provide a document that's not actually the official document, right? That's something that they've just written up for a Western company, right? So it's important to actually get, first of all, the real documentation, but then second, to verify that the documentation is actually something that's taking place. So for suppliers, right, this is something that companies are used to doing in other contexts as well. So it's just important to make sure that there's follow-up, and that companies, when they're doing their due diligence, are at least incorporating in there some amount of spot checking with workers to ensure that what's being reported to the company is actually what's taking place on the ground.
John, we've been focusing on the S in ESG in some of these questions, and the sustainability, the parts of your supply chain that may hold people held in bondage or workers that are exploited, and it's certainly a critical role. But there's also an E in ESG. And what I really wanted to maybe explore with you is the more difficult question I see of how companies can accurately, I guess maybe start with trying to make a difference around climate change in some of these geographic areas, but then how do they properly report it so that they've met U.S. or other reporting standards? Or are we just at a nascent part of our conversation where we're just starting to explore these issues?
No, I mean, I think funny enough, with the environmental reporting, I think it's actually much easier to do the reporting, because the reporting is pretty advanced at this point. Whether you're doing carbon reporting, whether you're doing reporting on things like recycling and where your waste is going, the reporting structures are in place from international organizations and NGOs, from academic institutions, to really allow for companies to do thorough environmental reporting. I think the hard thing is when you go from zero to starting to report, it's really tough not tough, you have to spend a lot of money, frankly, if you're a big company, to get from zero to adequate reporting. There's a big gap between nothing and something. Whereas if you have some level of reporting going on, upscaling it tends to be less burdensome. But there's a certain amount of learning costs and actual costs that go into just simply monitoring things. So simply monitoring how much energy you're using and what the carbon intensity of that energy is, where your waste is actually going. And then even beyond that, right, where are your workers coming from? How do they get to work? All those things factor into whether it's carbon reporting or waste reporting, but the various environmental structures related to reporting are sufficiently intense at this point and sufficiently detailed that pretty much every company in every industry could do it well if they had the time and the focus to do it.
John, I often tell people that 80% of ESG you're probably already doing now. And when I say that, I'm thinking about diversity inclusion, I'm thinking about supply chain, I'm thinking about not paying bribes and doing business in compliance, and then good corporate governance practices up and down the corporation. But it strikes me in listening to your last answer that companies actually may be doing a lot more environmental, the E part of ESG, than they actually realize, because you have to account on either a financial basis or a procurement basis for the energy you consume. You may not be reporting it under the E of ESG, but I bet somewhere you've got a payment stub for we paid X this month or X this year. And so it seems to me that data is there. It's not categorized and analyzed really from the ESG perspective, but even when you say going from sort of zero to to adequate reporting, they may be a lot further along than they realize if they just take a look at it in a different way. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think so. I think the other problem is there's a lot of siloing in larger organizations where someone might have the data, but the organization doesn't have it systematically or categorically across the organization. So you might have procurement has particular data that's not being shared across the entire organization. So when folks are trying to do reporting, the reporting folks may not even know that procurement or anybody else actually has this information. So I had one company who I consulted for who the facilities unit had incredibly detailed energy data on a building by building basis, but nobody had asked them whether they had that data. And so the folks who were trying to do the report were spinning their wheels trying to figure out, where do we get this from? And no one had ever asked the facilities folks. So finally, the chief operating officer mentioned just offhandedly in a meeting where the facilities head was present that they were, they were having trouble finding this data. And the facilities person just put up their hands and said, "Oh, we have that, we have it," and they had very detailed data. So I think your point is spot on that a lot of times companies are collecting this information, but they just don't know where it is. Especially in larger organizations, they may not have a good data management and data sharing policy, which is a broader issue, right? So that's why I think we see in a lot of companies a shift to hiring more data managers and hiring more information specialists who can help bridge those types of gaps.
Are you getting either consulting requests or other requests from corporations to help them understand not simply what their obligations might be, but how to report the information and actually build out and use it going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot on two fronts. There's a lot of push on the company side for more formalized reporting. And I think they're using the accounting firms, frankly, have done an excellent job of trying to build out their abilities to do that sort of reporting and to help companies create accounting frameworks related to that, again, especially at the bigger companies. But I think the other thing we're seeing is much more intent and much more money put behind reporting related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So whether that's on the environmental side, because the SDGs are very broad and they tend to cover all of ESG, or on the social side or the governance side, I think we see companies that are much more focused on trying to align what they're doing with what not only other companies are doing, but with what governments and civil society actors are doing on these sustainable development goals.
So, what have you seen or actually done any studies of corporate responses in conflict zones and in areas of climate change where you're able to track any of the results, or is that something that you're perhaps considering as well?
Yeah, so it's I would say this is the holy grail of our field is to try to figure out how business can try to track businesses before, during, and after conflict and the societies that they operate in to see the direct impacts. It's really hard, and it's hard because first of all, it's hard because almost all data in conflict zones, even casualty data, is sometimes hard to come by, and it's hard to find reliable data. I would say casualty data is the best data that we have, but even when you try to measure things like destruction, right? So if you're trying to put economic values on the burning of a factory or a village or a town or something, it's often hard to even get that kind of data. Never mind trying to actually talk to people, which is most of what my research is, right? Is interviewing people and companies to try to get the lay of the land and see where the process is. So what that means from a studying standpoint is a lot of it is going to be secondary or indirect to what we actually want to measure. So when we look at things like the impact of a CSR policy or program in a conflict zone, it's often hard to know how much of an impact that program has because there's so many other things going on around it. So there was a great program that Chevron ran in Nigeria after there was a set of ethnic clashes And Nigeria and Chevron decided, look, we have to do a much better job of engaging with the local community. And they put together this incredible project where they would work with local community leaders and basically provide funding to the projects that this multi-stakeholder dialogue committee would decide in each territory, in each group. They would basically decide how to spend the money. And Chevron would get, obviously, a say in that, but would really empower the local communities to spend the money in ways that were going to help benefit them and build peace. Great program. It's really hard to draw direct measures on what the impact is of the Chevron policies by themselves and the program by themselves versus all the other things that were going on around it. And that's probably the one we have the best information on. So in other settings, it's really hard to draw definitive judgments about the success or failure of particular programs in contributing to peace.
Let me end with another pretty big picture question, which is, as you know, I tend to focus on a corporate response to the international scourge of bribery and corruption through compliance programs, through compliance with laws such as the UK Bribery Act, the US FCPA, French Perform Due, or whatever the anti-corruption regime is. And I wanted to conclude by asking you, do you see a role for for-profit corporations in this, or is this really better left, in your opinion, to NGOs?
I mean, I think with respect to anti-corruption and bribery and to conflict zones, I think the issue is that it's everybody's responsibility. So everybody has to contribute in meaningful ways, in the ways that they can, even if there's primary players. So I would say on the peace front, the primary players are still going to be the conflict actors themselves, right? So it's still governments, it's still non-state armed groups. But everyone else is impacted by conflict, and so everybody else should be at the table trying to figure out ways to deal with this, and that includes for-profit companies. That's especially true in places where for-profit companies have a considerable amount of power, right? So this is another dynamic, is that in some conflict zones, the private sector is a minimal player, while in others, they're really powerful players, whether it's because they're very large companies as compared to the government, or because there's lots of small players who through business associations are able to influence things. So a nice example is in Tunisia, the business association, right, the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce in Tunisia, played a really key role in creating peace in Tunisia, right? So making sure that there was a just transition and trying to make sure that there was a peaceful transition. In fits and starts, sure, but that's why the head of the Chamber of Commerce was one of the 4 Nobel Peace Prize awardees from Tunisia, from that transition. So if the more power that the private sector has, the more it has to play that role. It really has to take on that role. But again, it's conflict area to conflict area specific because every place is so different.
Well, John, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to thank you. As always, it's a fascinating discussion with you, and I greatly hope we can continue this conversation.
I hope so too, and thanks so much again for the invite, Tom, and hopefully we'll chat soon.